From July 2023 until now, the world has been shocked as Russia intensifies its efforts to destroy Ukraine's grain storage facilities. This is not the first time, because in fact back in 1932, Stalin did something very similar, and as a result, more than 4 million Ukrainians died of starvation. Many people are starting to worry, could that horrifying history be repeating itself? But why? As soon as he took full control, Stalin set his sights on Ukraine. He knew that if he wanted to strengthen his grip on power and industrialize the Soviet Union, Ukraine was the key. Because this was no ordinary land. But to understand why Ukraine mattered so much, we need to look back at the early 20th century. At that time, Russia fell into a crisis. The First World War had just ended. The Russian Empire, which once ruled hundreds of millions, had officially collapsed. Many regions under the Tsar's control began demanding independence. Ukraine was one of the most determined. In 1918, Ukrainian patriots established the Ukrainian People's Republic. They declared independence, built their own government, issued a constitution, and formed an army. But this government soon fell into crisis. It was because Ukraine became a battleground for influence between many forces. The Bolshevik Red Army entered from the east, aiming to reclaim this rich agricultural land. Poland wanted to seize the west. Within Ukraine, deep divisions grew because some supported democracy, others leaned toward monarchy. No single force was strong or united enough to defend the young republic. As a result, the Ukrainian People's Republic collapsed in 1921. The Soviet Union, under Bolshevik leadership, quickly occupied Ukraine. By 1922, most of Ukraine's territory had been annexed into the Soviet Union. It was renamed the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. At that time, it was one of the largest republics in the USSR. After the annexation, the Soviet government faced a difficult question: how to stabilize a land that had just failed to gain independence, yet had a strong national identity. To ease resistance, the Bolsheviks allowed Ukrainians to preserve and develop their own cultural identity within the framework of socialism. This became known as the policy of Ukrainization. Local governments in Ukraine were allowed to use the Ukrainian language. Schools taught in the mother tongue. Public offices used Ukrainian in both communication and paperwork. Ukrainian language newspapers spread widely. Ukrainian literature was encouraged and published. This policy brought a period of relative stability, but Stalin never saw the annexation as a permanent solution. He believed that a nation which once declared independence could rise up again. What worried Stalin even more was Ukraine's strong economic foundation. Ukraine was not just an administrative region. This is one of the most fertile farming regions in Europe, perfect for growing grains, especially wheat, corn, and barley. Vast fields stretching for thousands of kilometers, with a mild climate and rich soil. Stalin understood that controlling Ukraine meant controlling both the food supply that sustained the Soviet Union and the foreign currency earned from exporting strategic agricultural products. But Ukrainians, especially the peasants, didn't want to be controlled. They were wealthier than farmers in other regions. They had their own land, and they were used to living independently. They made up 80% of Ukraine's population and were the backbone of its social and cultural life. To Stalin, this was a double threat. On one hand, their wealth meant they had no need for the party or the government. On the other hand, their strong economy could fuel a renewed independent national identity. Ukraine's intellectual class, like writers, clergy, and teachers, was awakening a distinct national consciousness: language, history, religion. Stalin was clever enough to understand that these things didn't just threaten Ukraine. They threatened the stability of the entire Soviet Union. If Ukraine's intelligentsia rose up in search of freedom, other Soviet republics might follow. To Stalin, that would be a political disaster. And at the same time, Stalin had set an ambitious goal: rapid industrialization to pull the Soviet Union out of backwardness. But to meet that goal, he needed money, and foreign currency would come from exporting grain. And so, Stalin made his decision. He began by collectivizing peasants. A massive collectivization campaign would allow the state to gather huge amounts of crops, both to feed the growing industrial workforce and to export for foreign currency, which would buy machines and technology for industrialization. He completely abolished private land ownership in Ukraine. Every field, cow, and plow was confiscated and merged into collective farms. Rich people in society were called kulaks, which means enemies. Their assets were seized. Many were exiled to remote parts of the Soviet Union or executed. Even farmers who resisted joining the collectives could be labeled kulaks. Once the land was taken, Stalin's system moved to seize the harvests. Authorities increased grain requisitions, even seizing seed meant for planting. Task forces were sent to ransack peasants' homes and take anything edible, from crops to personal belongings and livestock. In the early 1930s, Stalin imposed unrealistically high grain quotas on Ukraine. In 1930, Ukraine harvested 22.3 million tons of grain. Among that, 7.7 million tons had to be delivered to the Soviet state, about 34.5% of the total yield. The tragedy didn't happen that year. This is just the first step. By 1931, bad weather, farmer resistance, strikes and protests made things worse. Most farmers couldn't grow enough to feed themselves. They began losing the will to work. Weeds covered the fields. All of this led to a dramatic drop in output, estimated at just 14 to 18 million tons. Despite the poor harvest, Ukraine was still required to deliver 7.25 million tons to the state, almost the same as the previous year. By 1932, famine had already struck thousands of villages. Yet that year alone, the Soviet Union still extracted 4.27 million tons of grain from Ukraine. That amount could have fed at least 12 million people for a year. Soviet records also show that by January 1933, the USSR had enough grain reserves to feed over 10 million people. But nothing was sent. Not a single relief shipment. To the outside world, Stalin pretended everything was fine. Exports continued to bring in foreign exchanges. Additionally, he ordered full blockades on villages that failed to meet quotas. Residents were banned from leaving or receiving supplies. 37 out of 392 districts in Ukraine were placed on this blacklist. They were cut off from aid and sealed off completely. It was, in essence, a death sentence for entire communities. To stop peasants from fleeing for food, in January 1933, Stalin and Molotov, the Soviet premier at the time, ordered the sealing of borders. The peasants were forced to return to their villages to starve. The internal passport system was introduced, but peasants were denied. Without passports, they couldn't buy train tickets, leave their districts, and survive. Then, Stalin signed the Law on 5 years of grain. All property on collective farms belonged to the state. Picking up fallen grain was sentenced to death. Hiding potatoes at home could mean execution. Even in starvation, no one was allowed to touch grain belonging to the state. At the same time, he turned against language and culture. Stalin saw Ukraine's cultural autonomy as a threat. He feared resistance to his policies could lead this country to break away from the USSR. So he began dismantling Ukraine's intellectual and cultural elite. The policy of Ukrainization was ended. Ukrainian books and newspapers were banned. Schools were brought under tight control. Writers, teachers, priests, and pro-Ukrainian officials were arrested, tortured, or executed. Anyone holding nationalistic beliefs would eventually be killed. In January 1933, Stalin sent Pavel Postyshev to Ukraine. He was like a viceroy. With absolute power, he launched a nationwide purge. Anyone suspected of nationalist thinking was branded counter-revolutionary. Many were shot without trial. Thousands of Ukrainian cultural and political figures vanished within months. Not only were people sealed off, information was locked away too. Stalin ordered the press to stay silent on the famine. No cries for help could leave the Soviet borders. No international aid was allowed. In that darkness, millions died on the land that, just a few years earlier, was known as the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. After everything Stalin had done, around 4 million Ukrainians died. Scholars estimate the number of victims to be between 3.5 and 7 million, with some estimates even higher. Recent research shows the highest famine-related death rates occurred in areas that were then part of Kyiv and Kharkiv province. At the peak of the famine in June 1933, as many as 28,000 people were dying of hunger every day. Yet no one was allowed to call it famine, because the Soviet authorities banned that word. They removed the word hunger from death certificates. It was replaced with typhus, exhaustion, or simply old age. Death registers were edited, left incomplete, or sent straight to the secret police unit. Those who survived were forced to forget. An entire generation grew up in silence, too afraid to speak of Holodomor, or admit they had gone hungry, or seen people dying in the street. The famine turned people into specters. They ate grass, tree bark, dogs, and cats. In some places, there were even reports of cannibalism. And in the end, even the survivors had no strength left to resist. 4,000 small uprisings broke out in the early 1930s. But by 1933, the peasants were exhausted. An empty stomach could no longer start a revolution. By the end of 1933, the Soviet government began resettling 117,000 people from Russia and Belarus into villages that had been wiped out. This drastically altered the ethnic balance in Ukraine. But the most painful truth is this: Stalin knew all. On June 10, 1932, two senior Soviet Ukrainian leaders, Grigory Petrovsky and Vlas Chabar, sent a letter to Stalin. They clearly described the spreading famine and begged him to reduce the grain quotas, but Stalin gave no reply. He issued no orders for aid. In August 1932, Stalin wrote a letter to Kakanovich, one of his closest and most loyal allies. At that time, nearly 50 district-level party committees had already protested the grain procurement plan, calling it unrealistic. Instead of addressing the crisis, Stalin expressed disappointment with Ukraine's leadership. He believed the entire leadership in Ukraine, from the party to local government and security forces, was weak, indecisive, and unwilling to crush lower-ranking officials. Stalin was furious. Instead of obeying directives like a disciplined party, local officials debated, negotiated, and opposed orders, like members of a democratic parliament. To Stalin, this was ideological betrayal. There was not a single line in his letters about sending help, not one word about easing the burden. On the contrary, he emphasized that unless harsh measures were taken, the Soviet Union could lose Ukraine. Even today, this remains a deeply controversial question. As of December 12, 2022, 21 nations and Ukraine itself had officially recognized the Holodomor as an act of genocide against the Ukrainian people. They argue that Stalin used famine as a political weapon to destroy Ukraine's desire for independence. Nowhere else, except Ukraine and the Kuban region, was subject to such extreme punishment. However, Russia rejects this view. The Russian government insists that the Holodomor was not genocide, but rather an unintended consequence of failed economic policies during the Soviet Union's industrialization and agricultural collectivization. They emphasize that Russians and Kazakhs also died of hunger. This debate is not only about the past, it's connected to the present. Nearly a century after the Holodomor, Ukrainian grain has once again become the center of a new conflict. If in the past, Stalin used hunger to break the will of a people, then today, Putin is using grain as a bargaining chip. Since late July 2023, Russia has carried out numerous airstrikes and drone attacks targeting grain warehouses in Izmail and ports along the Danube River. About 300,000 tons of grain were destroyed in attacks during 2023. Nearly 40,000 tons of grain that were set to be exported to Africa, China, and Israel were severely damaged. Black Sea ports such as Odessa, Chornomorsk, and Reni have also been repeatedly hit by Russian missiles and drones, all aimed at disrupting Ukraine's grain exports. In July 2023, Russia withdrew from the Black Sea grain deal and continued to attack ports and grain ships. The total damage to Ukraine's agricultural sector reached $10.3 billion, including more than 300 port facilities and around 100,000 tons of grain destroyed. But why is Russia doing this? It is using Ukraine grain as leverage to gain the upper hand in the Russia-Ukraine war. First, Russia wants to cripple Ukraine's grain export sector, which is the country's second largest source of foreign currency. Second, by disrupting the global food supply, Russia can create pressure and instability in countries that depend on Ukrainian grain. This gives them more leverage in international negotiations. For example, when Russia pulled out of the Black Sea grain deal, Moscow demanded that Western countries lift sanctions on its agricultural sector and reconnect Roselkazbank to the SWIFT system. All of this shows that Russia doesn't just want to win on the battlefield. It also wants to use food as a bargaining chip to reach deeper political goals. Even after nearly a century, Ukraine has never escaped the struggle over control of grain. Here, grain is not just food, it's a weapon of power. Whoever controls grain can control economies, politics, and even the survival of dependent nations. Stalin once used it to crush Ukraine's will for independence. Putin now uses it to bargain with the world. And for Ukraine, the price of grain has been its very freedom.